Welcome to A Cow Jumped Over the Moon Theater does a reading of an abridged version of A Christmas Carol by one Mr. Charles Dickens. So we're not doing a virtual play tonight. We are doing a live readers theater of the classic Christmas tale. I am not the only one here. I have three other lovely people with me. We have reading for Scrooge amongst many others. Bree from LGBT. I'm stumped. LGBT. Welcome. Maybe. Yes. Reading for The Ghost of Christmas Past, amongst many other characters, is Marcia Ruiz. And reading for Jacob Marley, Ghost of Christmas Present, and many other characters, is Britt from The Non-Binary Barista. We are your cast for the evening. I am Charles Dickens, our narrator. And yeah, let us just take you away. Is everybody ready to go? All right, here we go. Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, Stave 1, Marley's Ghost. Marley was dead to begin with. There was no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade, but the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it. On the country's done for it. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead. Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole minister, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, and his sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I am going to relate. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night in an easterly wind upon the own ramparts than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot, say, St. Paul's churchyard, for instance, literally to astonish his son's weak mind. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood, years afterward, above the warehouse door. Scrooge and Marley, the firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people knew to the business called Scrooge, and sometimes Marley. But he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. Secret and self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in this grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head and on his eyebrows and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about him. He iced his office in the long dog days, and he didn't thaw 1 degree at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitter than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose, no pelting rain less open to entry. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say, "What gladsome looks! My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind man's dog appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and then would wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, dark master." But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance. What was the knowing ones call nuts to Scrooge? Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting-house, down beating their hands upon the breast and stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warm them. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and candles were flaring in the windows in the neighboring offices like ruddy smears upon the palpable brown air. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole and was so dense without that, although the court was the narrowest, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. To see the dingy cloud come drooping down, obscuring everything, one might have thought that nature lived hard by and was brewing on a large scale. The door to Scrooge's counting-house was open that he might keep that eye upon his clerk, who in a dismal little cell beyond a sort of tank was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire. The clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put it on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed.
Merry Christmas, Uncle. God save you.
Cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation he had his approach.
Ah, humbug!
He had so heated himself with the rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was in all aglow, his face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again.
Christmas a humbug, Uncle. You do not mean that, I am sure.
I do. Merry Christmas! What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough.
Come, then, what right have you to be dismal? What reason have you to be morose? You're rich enough.
Scrooge, having no better answer ready on the spur of the moment, said,
Bah, humbug!
Don't be cross, Uncle.
What else can I be? When I live in such a world of fools as this. Merry Christmas! Out upon Merry Christmas! What Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money? A time for finding yourself a year older but not an hour richer? A time for balancing your books and having every item in them, though a round dozen of months presented dead against you. If I could work my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. He should.
Uncle.
Nephew, keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mine.
Keep it, but you don't keep it.
Leave it alone then. Let me leave it alone then. Much good may it do to you, much good it has ever done to you.
There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say. Christmas among the rest, but I'm sure I have always thought of Christmas time when it has come around. Apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the only time I know of in the long calendar of the year, when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, Uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good, and will do me good, and I say, God bless it.
The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. Becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety, he poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever.
Let me hear another sound from you, and you'll keep Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite a powerful speaker, sir. I wonder you don't go into Parliament.
Don't be angry, Uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow.
Scrooge said that he would see them. Yes, indeed he did. He went the whole length of the expression and said that he would see him in that extremity first.
But why?
Why did you get married?
Because I fell in love.
Because you fell in love.
As if that were the only thing in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas.
Good afternoon.
Aye, Uncle, but you never came to see me before that happened. Why give it as a reason for not coming now?
Good afternoon.
I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends?
Good afternoon.
I'm sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute. We have never had any quarrel to which I have been a party, but I have made a trial in homage to Christmas and have killed my Christmas humor to the last. So a Merry Christmas, Uncle.
Good afternoon.
And a Happy New Year!
Good afternoon.
His nephew left the room without an angry word, notwithstanding. He stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially.
There's another fellow. My clerk, with 15 shillings a week and a wife and a family, talking about Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam.
This lunatic, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let 2 other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood, with their hats off, in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands and bowed to him.
Scrooge and Marley's, I believe,
said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list.
Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?
Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years. He died 7 years this very night.
We have no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner,
said the gentleman, presenting his credentials. It certainly was, for they had been 2 kindred spirits. At the ominous word liberality, Scrooge frowned and shook his head and handed the credentials back.
At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge,
said the gentleman, taking up a pen,
it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comfort, sir.
Are there no prisons?
Plenty of prisons.
And the union workhouses? Are they still in operation?
They are, still. I wish I could say they were not.
The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor then?
Both very busy, sir.
Oh, I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them on their useful course. I'm very glad to hear it.
Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude, a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time, of all others, when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for?
Nothing.
You wish to be anonymous?
I wish to be left alone. Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I helped to support these establishments I have mentioned. They've cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there.
Many can't go there, and many would rather die.
If they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that.
But you might know it.
It's not my business. It's enough for a man to understand his own business and not to affair with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Seeing clearly that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentleman withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labors with an improved opinion of himself and in a more facetious temper than was usual with him. At length the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. With an ill-will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool and tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly stuffed his candle out and put on his hat.
You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose.
If quite convenient, sir.
It's not convenient, and it's not fair. I was to stop half a crown for it. You think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound?
The clerk smiled faintly.
And yet, you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wage for no work.
The clerk observed that it was only once a year.
A poor excuse for a man's pocket. A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier the next morning.
The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no great coat, went down a slide on Cornhill at the end of the Lane of Boys 20 times in honor of its being Christmas Eve, and they ran home to Camden Town as hard as they could pelt to play a blind man's bluff. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. Now it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except it was very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen it, night and morning, during his whole residence at that place. Also, that Scrooge had a little of what was called a fancy about himself as any man in the city of London, even including, which is a bold word, the corporation, alderman, and livery. Let it alone be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that afternoon. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw the knocker without it undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face, it was not impenetrable shadow as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on his ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred as if by breath of hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That and its livid color made it horrible. But its horror seemed to be in spite of the face and beyond its control rather than a part of its own expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled or that his blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation to which it had been a stranger from infancy would be untrue. But he put his hand upon the key he had relinquished, turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. He did pause, with a moment's irresolution, before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it first, as if he half expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtails sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back door, except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on, so he said pooh-pooh and closed it with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellar below appeared to have a separate pearl of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs slowly too, trimming his candle as he went. Up Scrooge went, not caring a button for that. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he watched through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, a small file in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and a little saucepan of gruel upon the hob. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual, old fire guard, old shoes, 2 fish baskets, washing stand on 3 legs, and a poker. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in, double-locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. After several turns, he sat down again, and he threw his head back in his chair. His glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the room, and communicated for some purpose now forgotten with a chamber at the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment, and with a strange, inexplicable dread, that as he looked he saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This might have lasted half a minute or a minute, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun, together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks of the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard the ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door.
It's humbug still. I won't believe it.
His color changed, though, when without a pause it came on through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leapt up, and though, as it cried,
I know him. Marley's ghost.
And fell again. The same face, the very same. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights, and boots, the tassels on the latter bristling like his pigtail, and his coat skirts, and hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through the waistcoat, could see the two buttons of his coat behind. Scrooge often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he had never believed it until now. No, nor did he believe it even now, though he looked through the phantom through and through and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes, and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief bound about its head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before. He was still incredulous, and fought against his senses.
How now? What do you want with me?
Much.
Marley's voice, no doubt about it.
Who are you?
Ask me who I was.
Who were you, then? You're particular for a shade, to a shade, but substitute to this as more appropriate.
In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley.
Can you sit down?
I can.
Do it then.
Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent must find himself in a condition to take a chair, and felt that, in the event of it being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, and he was quite used to it.
You don't believe in me?
I don't.
What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses?
I don't know.
Why do you doubt your senses?
Because a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blob of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an undertoned potato. There's more of gravy than grave about you, whatever you are.
Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any means waggish then. The truth is that he tried to be smart as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his terror, for the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones. To sit staring at those fixed glazed eyes in silence for a moment would play, Scrooge felt, the very deuce with him. There was something very awful, too, in the spectre's being provided with an infernal atmosphere of its own. Scrooge could not feel it himself, but this was clearly the case, for though the ghost sat perfectly motionless, his hair and skirts and tassels were still agitated as by the hot vapors from an oven.
You see this toothpick?
I do,
You are not looking at it.
but I see it notwithstanding.
Well, I have but to swallow this and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, all of my own creation. Humbug, I tell you, humbug.
At this, the spirit raised a frightful cry and shook its chains with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bondage round its head as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face.
Mercy, dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me?
Man of the worldly mind, do you believe in me or not?
I do, I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?
It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world. Oh, woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth and turned to happiness.
Again the spectre raised a cry and shook its chain and wrung its shadowy hands.
You are fettered. Tell me why.
I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you?
Scrooge trembled more and more.
Or would you know the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy and as long as this. 7 Christmas Eves ago, you have labored on it since. It is ponderous chain.
Scrooge glanced about him on the floor, in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing.
Jacob, old Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob.
I have none to give. It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of men. Nor can I tell you what I would. A very little more is all permitted to me. I cannot rest, I cannot stay, I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me, in life my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me.
It was a habit with Scrooge, whenever he became thoughtful, to put his hands in his breeches pockets. Pondering on what the ghost had said, he did so now, but without lifting up his eyes or getting off his knees.
You must have been slow about it, Jacob.
Slow?
7 years dead, and traveling all this time?
The whole time. No rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse.
You travel fast?
On the wings of the wind.
You might have gotten over a great quantity of ground in 7 years.
The ghost, on hearing this, set up another cry, and clanked its chain so hideously in the dead silence of the night that the ward would have been justified in indicating it for a nuisance.
Oh, captive bound and double ironed, not to know that ages of incessant labor by immortal creatures, for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is all developed. Not to know that any Christian spirit working kindly in its little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one's life opportunity misused, yet such was I. Oh, such was I.
But you were always a good man of business, Jacob.
Business? Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business.
It held up its chain at arm's length, as if it were the cause of all its unavailing grief, and flung it heavenly upon the ground again.
At this time of the rolling year, I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down, and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me?
Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly.
Hear me, my time is nearly gone.
I will, but don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob, pray.
How is it that I appear before you in a shape that you can see? I may not tell. I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day.
It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow.
That is no light part of my penance. I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and a hope of escaping my fate, a chance and a hope of my procuring Ebenezer.
You were always a good friend to me. Thank you.
You will be haunted by 3 spirits.
Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost's had done.
Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob?
It is.
I think I'd rather not.
Without their visits, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow, when the bell tolls 1.
Couldn't I take them all at once and have it over, Jacob?
Expect the second on the next night, at the same hour. The third upon the next night, when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see no more, and look that, For your own sake, you remember what has passed between us.
When it had said these words, the spectre took its wrapper from the table and bound it round its head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound its teeth made when the jaws were brought together by the bandage. He ventured to raise his eyes again, and found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an erect attitude with its chain wound over and around its arm. The apparition walked backward from him, and at every step it took, the window raised a little, so when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up its hand, warning him not to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped, not so much in obedience as in surprise and fear, for on the raising of the hand he became sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge and floated upon the bleak dark night. Scrooge followed to the window, desperate in his curiosity. He looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Some few were linked together. None were free. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He'd been quite familiar with one old ghost in a white waistcoat with a monstrous iron safe attached to its ankle, who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant whom it saw below upon a doorstep. The misery with them all was clearly that they sought to interfere for good in human matters, and had lost the power forever. Whether these creatures faded into mist or mist enshrouded them, he could not tell. But they and their spirit voices faded together, and the night became as it had been when he walked home. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double-locked as he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. He tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable. And being from the emotion of his undergoing the fatigues of the day, or his glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, went straight to bed without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. Stave 2, the first of the 3 spirits. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of bed, he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber. He was endeavoring to pierce the darkness with his ferret eyes when the chimes of a neighboring church struck the 4 quarters. So he listened for the hour. To his great astonishment, the heavy bell went on from 6 to 7 and from 7 to 8, and regularly up to 12, then stopped. 12! It was past 2 when he went to bed. The clock was wrong. An icicle must have gone into the works. 12.
Why, it isn't possible that I could have slept through a whole day and far into another night. It is impossible that anything has happened to the sun, and this is 12 at noon.
The idea of being an alarming one. He scrambled out of bed and groped his way to the window. He was obliged to rub the frost off with the sleeve of his dressing gown before he could see anything, and could see very little then. All he could make out was that it was still very foggy and extremely cold, and that there was no noise of people running to and fro and making a great stir, as there unquestionably would have been if night had been beaten off by bright day and taken possession of the world. This was a great relief, because 3 days after sight of the first exchange paid to Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge, or his order, and so forth, would have become a mere United States security if there were no days to count by. Scrooge went to bed again, and thought and thought and thought it over and over and over, and could make nothing of it. The more he thought, the more perplexed he was, and the more he endeavored not to think, the more he thought. Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Every time he resolved within himself about mature inquiry that it was all just a dream, his mind flew back again like a strong spring released to its first position, and presented the same problem to be worked through.
Was it a dream or not?
Scrooge lay in this state until the chime had gone 3 quarters more, when he remembered on a sudden that the ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. He resolved to lie awake until the hour had passed, and then, considering that he could no more go to sleep than go to heaven, this was perhaps the wisest resolution in his power. The quarter was so long that he was more than once convinced he must have sunk into a doze unconsciously and missed the clock. At length it broke upon listening ear. Ding dong.
A quarter past.
Ding dong.
Half past.
Ding dong.
A quarter to it.
Ding dong.
The hour itself, and nothing else.
He spoke before the hour bell sounded, which it now did with a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy one. Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by a hand. Not the curtains at his feet, nor the curtains at his back, but those to which his face was addressed. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge, staring up into a half-recumbent attitude, found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them as close to it as I am now to you, and I am standing in spirit at your elbow. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white, as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same as if its hold were an uncommon strength. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were like those upper members bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hands, and, in singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that, from the crown on its head, there sprung a bright clear jet of light, by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using in its duller moments a great extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arm. Even this, though, when Scrooge looked at it with increasing steadiness, was not its strangest quality. For as its belt sparkled and glittered now in one part and now in another, and what was light one instant at another time was dark, so the figure itself fluctuated in its distinctness, being now a thing with one arm, now with one leg, now with 20 legs, now a pair of legs without a head, now a head without a body, of which dissolving parts no outline would be visible in the dense gloom wherein they melted away, and in the very wonder of this it would be itself again, distinct and clear as ever.
Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me?
I am.
Who and what are you?
I am the ghost of Christmas past.
Long past?
No, your past.
Perhaps Scrooge could not have told anybody why if anybody would have asked, but he had a special desire to see the spirit in his cap and begged him to be covered.
What? Would you so soon put out with worldly hands the light I give? Is it not enough that you are one of those whose passion made this cap and forced me through whole trains of years to wear it low upon my brow?
Scrooge reverently disclaimed all intention to offend or any knowledge of having wilfully bonneted the spirit at any period of his life. He then made bold to inquire what business brought him there.
Your welfare.
Scrooge expressed himself much obliged, but could not help thinking that a night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive to that end. The spirit must have heard him thinking, for it said immediately,
Your reclamation, then, take heed.
It put out its strong hand as it spoke and clasped him gently by the arm.
Rise and walk with me.
It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that bed was warm and the thermometer a long way below freezing, that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown and nightcap, and that he had a cold upon him at the time. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He rose, but finding that the spirit made towards the window, clasped his robe in supplication.
I am a mortal and liable to fall.
Bear but a touch of my hand there, and you shall be upheld in more than this.
As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road with fields on either hand. The city had entirely vanished. Not a vestige of it was to be seen. The darkness and the mist had vanished with it, for it was clear, cold winter day with snow upon the ground.
Good heaven, I was bred in this place. I was a boy here.
The spirit gazed upon him mildly. Its gentle touch, though it had been light and instantaneous, appeared still present to the old man's sense of feeling. He was conscious of 1,000 odors floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares long, long forgotten.
Your lips trembling, and what is that upon your cheek?
Scrooge muttered with an unusual catching in his voice that it was a pimple, and begged the ghost to lead him where it would.
You recollect the way?
Remember it. I could walk it blindfolded.
Strange to have forgotten it for so many years. Let us go on.
They walked along the road, Scrooge recognizing every gate and post and tree, until a little market town appeared in the distance with its bridge, its church, and winding river. Some shaggy ponies now were seen, though towards them with the boys upon their backs, who called to other boys in country gigs and carts driven by farmers. All these boys were in great spirits and shouted to each other, until the broad fields were so full of merry music that the crisp air laughed to hear it.
These are but shadows of the things that have been. They have no consciousness of us.
The jocund travellers came on, and as they came, Scrooge knew and named them every one. Why was he rejoiced beyond all bounds to see them? Why did his cold eye glisten and his heart leap up as they went past? Why was he filled with gladness when he heard them give each other a Merry Christmas as they parted in crossroads and byways for their several homes? What was Merry Christmas to Scrooge? Out upon Merry Christmas! What good had it ever done him?
The school is not quite deserted. A solitary child neglected by his friends is left there still.
Scrooge said he knew it, and he sobbed. They left the high road by a well-remembered lane, and soon approached a mansion of dull red brick with a little weathercock-surmounted cupola on the roof and a bell hanging in it. It was a large house, but one of broken fortunes, for the spacious offices were little used. Their walls were damp and mossy, their windows broken, and their gates decayed. Fowls clucked and strutted in the stables, and the coach houses and sheds were overrun with grass. Nor was it more retentive of its ancient state within, for entering the dreary hall and glancing through the open doors of many rooms, they found them poorly furnished, cold, and vast. There was an earthy savour in the air, a chilly bareness in the place, which associated itself somehow with too much getting up by candlelight and not too much to eat. They went, the ghost and Scrooge, across the hall to a door at the back of the house. It opened before them and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room, made barer still by lines of plain deal forms and desks. At one of these lonely boys was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge sat down upon a form and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he used to be. Not a latent echo in the house, nor squeak and scuffle from the mice behind the panelling, not a drip from the half-thawed water-spout in the dull yard behind, not a sigh among the leafless boughs of one despondent poplar, not the idle swinging of an empty storehouse door. No, not a clicking in the fire, but fell upon the heart of Scrooge with a softening influence and gave a freer passage to his tears. The spirit touched him on the arm and pointed to his younger self, intent upon his reading. Suddenly, a man in foreign garments, wonderfully real and distinct to look at, stood outside the window with an axe stuck in his belt and leading by the bridle an ass laden with wood.
Why, it's Ali Baba. It's dear old honest Ali Baba. Yes, yes, I know it. One Christmas time when yonder solitary child was left here and alone, he did come. For the first time, just like that. Poor boy. And Valentine. And his wild brother Orson. There they go. And what's his name? Who was put down in his drawers asleep at the gate of Damascus. Don't you see him? And the Sultan's groom turned upside down by the genie. There, upon his head. Served him right. I'm glad of it. What business had he to be married to the princess?
To hear Scrooge expending all the earnestness of his nature on such subjects, in a most extraordinary voice between laughing and crying, and to see his heightened and excited face would have been a surprise to his business friends in the city indeed.
Here's the parrot, green body and yellow tail with a thing like a lettuce growing out the top of its head. There he is. Poor Robin Crusoe, he called him, when he came home after sailing round the island. Poor Robin Crusoe. Where have you been, Robin Crusoe? The man thought he was dreaming, but he wasn't. It was a parrot. It was the parrot, you know? There goes Friday, running for his life to the little creek. Hallo, hoop, hallo.
Then, with rapidity of transition very foreign to his usual character, he said in a pity for his former self,
Oh boy,
and cried again.
I wish.
Scrooge muttered, putting his hand in his pocket and looking about him after drying his eyes with his cuff.
But it's too late now.
What is the matter?
Nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should have given him something, that's all.
The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved its hand, saying as it did so,
Let us see another Christmas.
Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and more dirty. The panels shrunk, the windows cracked, the fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling, and the naked laths were shown instead. But how all this was brought about, Scrooge knew no more than you do. He only knew that it was quite correct, that everything had happened so, that there he was, alone again, when all the other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays. He was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost, and with a mournful shaking of his head, glanced anxiously toward the door. It opened. A little girl, much younger than the boy, came starting in, and putting her arms around his neck and often kissing him, addressed him as her.
Dear, dear brother, I have come to bring you home, dear brother, to bring you home, home, home. Let us go home.
Oh, little fan.
Yes, home for good and all, home for ever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be. That home is like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home. And he said, yes, you should, and send me in a coach to bring you, and you're to be a man. And are never to come back here, but first we're to be together all the Christmas long and have the merriest time in all the world.
You are quite a woman, little fan.
She clapped her hands and laughed and tried to touch his head, but being too little, laughed again and stood on tiptoe to embrace him. Then she began to drag him in her childish eagerness towards the door, and he, nothing loth to go, accompanied her. A terrible voice in the hall cried,
Bring down Master Scrooge's box there.
and in the hall appeared the schoolmaster himself, who glared on Master Scrooge with a ferocious condescension, and threw him into a dreadful state of mind by shaking hands with him. He then conveyed him and his sister into the veriest old well of a shivering best parlour that was ever seen, where the maps upon the wall and the celestial and terrestrial globes in the windows were waxy with cold. Here he produced a decanter of curiously light wine and a block of curiously heavy cake, and administered installments of those dainties to the young people, at the same time sending out a meagre servant to offer a glass of something to the postboy, who answered that he thanked the gentleman, but if it was the same tap as he had tasted before, he had rather not. Master Scrooge's trunk being by this time tied on the top of the chaise, the children bade the schoolmaster goodbye right willingly, and getting into it, drove gaily down the garden sweep, the check wheels dashing the hoar frost and snow from the dark leaves of the evergreens like spray.
Always a delicate creature, whom a breath might have withered, but she had a large heart.
So she had. You're right. I will not gainsay it, Spirit. God forbid it.
She died a woman, and had, as I think, children.
One child.
True. Your nephew.
Yes.
Although they had but a moment left, the school behind them, they were now in the busy thoroughfares of a city, where shadowy passengers passed and repassed, where shadowy carts and coaches battled for the way, and all the strife and tumult of a real city were. It was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops that here too it was Christmas time again. But it was evening, and the streets were light up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it.
Know it? Was I apprenticed here?
They went in, at sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig sitting behind such a high desk that if he had been 2 inches taller, he must have knocked his head against the ceiling. Scrooge cried in great excitement,
Why, it's old Fezziwig. Bless his heart. It's Fezziwig, alive again.
Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clocks, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself from his shoes to his organ of benevolence, and called out in a comfortable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice,
Yo-ho there, Ebenezer, Dick!
Scrooge's former self, now grown a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice.
Dick Wilkins, to be sure. Bless me. Yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me, was Dick. Poor Dick. Dear, dear.
Yo-ho, my boys, no more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick, Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up before a man can say Jack Robinson.
You wouldn't believe how those two fellows went at it. They charged into the street with the shutters. 1, 2, 3, had 'em up in their places. 4, 5, 6, barred 'em and pinned 'em. 7, 8, 9, and came back before you could have got to 12 paintings like racehorses.
Hilly-ho, clear away, my lads, and let's have lots of room here. Hilly-ho, Dick, cheer up, Ebenezer.
Clear away! There was nothing they wouldn't have cleared away, or couldn't have cleared away with old Fezziwigs looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off as if it were dismissed from public life for evermore. The floor was swept and watered, and the lamps were trimmed. Fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright as a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter's night. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired but the two prentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which were under a counter in the back shop. During the whole of this time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self, he corroborated everything, remembered everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. It was not until now, when the bright faces of his former self and Dick were turned from them, that he remembered the ghost, and became conscious that it was looking full upon him, while the light upon its head burnt very clear.
A small matter, to make these silly folk so full of gratitude.
Small.
The spirit signed to him to listen to the two apprentices who were pouring out their hearts in praise of Fezziwig, and when he had done so, said,
Why, is it not? He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much that he deserved this praise?
It isn't that. It isn't that, Spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. Say that his power lies in words and looks, and a thing so slight and insignificant that is impossible to add and count him up. What then? The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it costs a fortune.
He felt the spirit's glance and stopped.
What is the matter?
Nothing particular.
Something, I think.
No, I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now. That's all.
His former self turned down the lamps as he gave utterance to the wish, and Scrooge and the ghost again stood side by side in open air.
My time grows short. Quick.
This was not addressed to Scrooge or to anyone whom he could see, but it produced an immediate effect, for again Scrooge saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of his life. His face had not the harsh and rigid lines of later years, but it had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice. There was an eager, greedy, restless motion in the eye, which showed the passion that had taken root, and where the shadow of growing tree would fall. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in a mourning dress, in whose eyes there were tears which sparked in the light that shone out the ghost of Christmas past.
It matters little. You very little. Another idol has displaced me, and if he can cheer and comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to do, I have not just cause to grieve.
What idol has displaced you?
A golden one?
That is the even-handled dealing of the world. There is nothing on which it is so hard as poverty, and there is nothing it professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuits of wealth.
You fear the world too much. All your other hopes have merged into the hope of being beyond the chance of its sordid approach. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one, until the master passion gain engrosses you. Have I not?
What then? Even if I were to grow so much wiser, what then? I am not changed towards you.
She shook her head.
Am I?
Our contract is an old one.
Our contract is an old one. It was made when we were both poor and content to be so, until in good season we could improve our worldly fortune by our patient industry. You are changed. When it was made, you were another man.
I was a boy.
Your own feeling tells you that you were not what you were. I am. That which promised happiness we were one in heart is fraught with misery now that we are two. How often and how keenly I have thought of this. I will not say it is enough that I have thought of it and can release you.
Have I ever sought release?
In words? No, never.
In what then?
In a changed nature, in an altered spirit, in another atmosphere of life, another hope as its great end. In everything that made my love of any worth or value in your sight, if this had never been between us. Tell me, would you seek me out and try to win me now? No.
He seemed to yield to the justice of this supposition in spite of himself, but he said with a struggle,
I think not.
I would gladly think otherwise if I could. Heaven knows. When I have learned a truth like this, I know how strong and irresistible it must be. But if you were free today, tomorrow, yesterday, can even I believe that you would choose a dowerless girl, you, who in your very confidence with her weigh everything by gain, or choosing her in for another moment, you were false enough to your one guiding principle to do so. Do I not know that your repentance and regret will surely follow? I do, and I release you with a full heart for the love of him you were once.
He was about to speak, but with her head turned from him, she resumed.
You may the memory of what is past have makes me hope you will have pain in this, a very, very brief time, and you will dismiss the recollection of it gladly as an unprofitable dream from which it happened well that you awoke. May you be happy in the life you have chosen.
She left him, and they parted.
Spirit, show me no more. Conduct me home. Why do you delight to torture me?
One shadow more.
No more. No more. I don't wish to see it. Show me no more.
But the relentless ghost pinioned him in both arms and forced him to observe what happened next. They were in another scene, in place, a room not very large or handsome, but full of comfort. Near to the winter fire sat a beautiful young girl, so like that last Scrooge believed it was the same until he saw her, now a comely matron, sitting opposite her daughter. The noise in this room was perfectly tumultuous, for there were more children there than Scrooge in his agitated state of mind could count, and unlike the celebrated herd in the poem, they were not 40 children conducting themselves like one, but every child was conducting itself like 40. But now a knocking at the door was heard, and such a rush immediately ensued that she was with laughing face and plundered dress was borne towards it in the center of a flushed and boisterous group just in time to greet the father, who came home attended by a man laden with Christmas toys and presents. Then the shouting and the struggling and the onslaught that was made of the defenseless porter. The joy and gratitude and ecstasy. They were all indescribable alike. It is enough that by degrees the children and their emotions got out of the parlor, and by one stair at a time up to the top of the house. There they went to bed, and so subsided. And now Scrooge looked on more attentively than ever, when the master of the house, having his daughter leaning fondly on him, sat down with her and her mother at his own fireside. And when he thought that such another creature, quite as graceful, as full of promise, might have called him father, and been a springtime in the haggard winter of his life, his sight grew very dim indeed.
Well,
said the husband, turning to his wife with a smile.
I saw an old friend of yours this afternoon. Who was it? Guess. How can I? Don't I know? Mr. Scrooge. Mr. Scrooge it was. I passed his office window, and as it was not shut up, and he had a candle inside, I could scarcely help seeing him. His partner lies upon the point of death, I hear, and there he sat alone. Quite alone in the world, I do believe.
Spirit, remove me from this place.
I told you these were shadows of the things that have been, that they are what they are. Do not blame me.
Remove me. I cannot bear it.
He turned upon the ghost, and seeing that it looked upon him with a face in which, in some strange way, there were fragments of all the faces it had shown him, wrestled with him.
Leave me. Take me back. Haunt me no longer.
In the struggle, if that can be called a struggle, in which the ghost, with no visible resistance on its own part, was undisturbed by any effort of its adversary, Scrooge observed that the light was burning high and bright and dimly connecting that with its influence over him. He seized the extinguisher cap and by a sudden action pressed it down upon its head. The spirit dropped beneath it, so that the extinguisher covered its whole form. But though Scrooge pressed it down with all its force, he could not hide the light which streamed from under it in an unbroken flood upon the ground. He was conscious of being exhausted and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and further of being in his own bedroom. He gave the cap a parting squeeze, in which he had relaxed, and had barely time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. Stave 3, the second of the three spirits. Awaking in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was again upon the stroke of 1. He felt that he was restored to consciousness in the right nick of time, for the especial purpose of holding a conference with the second messenger dispatched to him through Jacob Marley's intervention. But, finding that he turned uncomfortably cold when he began to wonder which of his curtains this new spectre would draw back, he put them every one aside with its own hands, and lying down again established a sharp lookout all round the bed. For he wished to challenge the spirit on the moment of its appearance, and did not wish to be taken by surprise and made nervous. Gentlemen of free and easy sort, who plume themselves on being acquainted with a move or two, and being usually equal to the time of day, express the wide range of their capacity for adventure, by observing that they are good for anything from pitch and toss to manslaughter, between which opposite extremes, no doubt, there lies a tolerably wide and comprehensive range of subjects. Without venturing for Scrooge quite as heartily as this, I don't mind calling on you to believe that he was ready for a good broad field of strange appearances, and that nothing between a baby and a rhinoceros would have astonished him very much. Now, being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing, and consequently, when the bell struck 1 and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour went by, yet nothing came. At last, however, he began to think, as you or I would have thought at first, for it's always the person not in the predicament who knows what ought to have been done in it, and would unquestionably have done it too, at last, I say. He began to think that the source and secret of this ghostly light might be in the adjoining room, from whence or further tracing it seemed to shine. This idea taking full possession of his mind, he got up softly and shuffled in his slippers into the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by name and bade him enter. He obeyed. It was his own room, there was no doubt about that, but it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceilings were so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove, from every part of which bright, gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light, as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there, and such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney as that dull petrification of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time or Marley's, or for many and many a winter season gone. Heaped up on the floor to form a kind of throne were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12th cakes, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In easy state upon this couch there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it up high to shed its light on Scrooge, and it came peeping round the door.
Come in, and know me better, man. I am the ghost of Christmas present. Look upon me.
Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple green robe, or mantle, bordered with white fur. This garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capricious breast was bare, as if disdaining to be warded or concealed by any artifice. Its feet, observable beneath the ample folds of the garment, were also bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath, set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free as its genial face, its sparkling eye, its open hand, its cheery voice, its unconstrained demeanor, and its joyful air. Girded round its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust.
You have never seen the like of me before?
Sure.
Have never walked forth with the younger members of my family? Meaning, for I'm very young, my elder brother's born in these later years.
I don't think I have. I'm afraid I have not. Have you many brothers, Spirit?
More than 1,800.
A tremendous family to provide for.
The ghost of Christmas present rose.
Spirit, conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion and learned a lesson, which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it.
Touch my robe.
Scrooge did as he was told and held it fast. Holly, mistletoe, red berries, ivy, turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, meat, pigs, sausages, oysters, pies, puddings, fruit, punch, all vanished instantly. So did the room, the fire, the ruddy glow, the hour of the night, and they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning, where the people made a rough but brisk and not unpleasant kind of music, in scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings, and from the top of their houses, whence it was mad delight to the boys to see it come plumping down into the road below, and splitting into artificial little snowstorms. The house fronts looked black enough, and the windows blacker, contrasting with the smooth white sheet of snow upon the roofs, and which, the dirtiest snow upon the ground, which last deposit had been ploughed up in deep furrows by the heavy wheels of carts and wagons, furrows that crossed and recrossed each one hundreds of times, where the great streets branched off and made intricate channels, hard to trace in the thick yellow mud and icy water. The sky was gloomy, and the shortest streets were choked up with a dingy mist, half thawed, half frozen, whose heavier particles descended in a shower of sooty atoms, as if all the chimneys in Great Britain had, by one consent, caught fire, and were blazing away to their dear hearts' content. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate of the town. And yet there was an air of cheerfulness abroad, the clearest summer air and brightest summer sun might have endeavored to diffuse in vain. For the people who were shoveling away on the housetops were jovial and full of glee, calling out to one another from the parapets, and now and then exchanging a facetious snowball, better natured and missile far than many a wordy jest, laughing heartily if it went right and not less heartily if it went wrong. The poulterers' shops were still half open, and the fruitiers were radiant in their glory. There were great round pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts shaped like the waistcoats of jolly old gentlemen lolling at the doors and tumbling out into the street in their apoplectic opulence. There were ruddy brown-faced, broad-girthed Spanish onions shining in the fatness of their growth like Spanish friars, and winking from their shelves in the wanton slyness as the girls as they went by and glanced demurely at the hung-up mistletoe. There were pears and apples clustered high in blooming pyramids. There were bunches of grapes made in the shopkeeper's benevolence to dangle from conspicuous hooks that people's mouths might water gratis as they passed. There were piles of filberts, mossy and brown, recalling in their fragrance ancient walks among the woods and pleasant shufflings, ankle-deep through withered leaves. There were Norfolk biffins, squat and swarthy, setting off the yellow of the oranges and lemons, and in the great compactness of their juicy persons, urgently entreating and beseeching to be carried home in paper bags and eaten after dinner. There were gold and silver fish set forth among these choicest fruits in a bowl, though members of a dull and stagnant-blooded race appeared gasping round and round their little world in slow and passionless excitement. But soon the steeples called good people all to church and chapel, and away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes and their gayest faces. In time the bells ceased, and the bakers were shut up, and yet there was a genial shadowing forth of all these dinners and the progress of their cooking in the thawed blotch of wet above each baker's oven, where the pavement smoked as if the stones were cracking too.
Is there a peculiar flavor, what you sprinkle from your torch?
There is my own.
Did it apply to any kind of dinner on the day?
To any kindly given, to a poor one most.
Why to a poor one most?
Because it needs it most.
Spirit, I wonder you and of all of the beings in the world about this should desire to cramp these people's opportunities of innocent enjoyment.
I?
You would deprive them of their means of dining every seventh day, often the only day which they can be said to dine at all. Wouldn't you? You seek to close these places on the seventh day, and it comes to the same thing.
I seek.
Forgive me if I am wrong. It has been done in your name, or at least that in your family.
There are some upon this earth of yours who lay claim to know us, who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, who are strange to us and all our kith and kin, as if they had never lived, Remember that, and charge their doings on themselves, not us.
Scrooge promised that he would, and they went on, invisible as they had been before, in the suburbs of the town. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost that, notwithstanding his gigantic size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, and that he stood beneath a low roof quite as gracefully and like a supernatural creature as it was possible he could have done in any lofty hall. And perhaps it was the pleasure the good spirit had in showing off his power, or else it was his own kind, generous, hearty nature, and his sympathy with all poor men that led him straight to Scrooge's clerks, for there he went, and took Scrooge with him. Holding to his robes, and on the threshold of the door, the spirit smiled, and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinkling of his torch. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons which are cheap, and make a goodly show for sixpence, and she laid the cloth assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of the potatoes. Getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar into his mouth, rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen in the fashionable parks. And now two smaller Cratchits, a boy and a girl, came tottering in. "What has ever got to your precious father, then?" said Mrs. Cratchit, "and your brother Tiny Tim and Martha, and everyone's late as Christmas Day by half an hour."
Here's Martha, mother. Here's Martha, mother. Hurrah, there's such a goose. Martha!
Why, bless your heart alive. My dear, how late you are.
We a deal of work to finish up last night and had to clear away this morning, mother.
Well, never mind so long as you are come. Sit ye before the fire, my dear, and have a warm. Lord bless ye.
No, there's father coming. Hide, Martha, hide.
So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father with at least 3 feet of comforter exclusive on the fringe hanging down before him, and in his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame.
Why, where's our Martha?
Not coming.
Not coming. Not coming upon Christmas Day?
Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only in joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms while the 2 young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash-house that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper.
And how did little Tim behave?
As good as gold, and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people saw him in the church, because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see.
Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool before the fire. And while Bob, turning up his cuffs as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and round, and put it on the hob to simmer, Master Peters, the 2 ubiquitous young Cratchits, went to fetch the goose, with which soon returned in high procession. At last the dinner was all done, the cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovel full of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however well as the golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and cracked noisily. Then Bob proposed.
A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us.
Which all the family re-echoed.
God bless us, everyone.
Tiny Tim sat very closely to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, and he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him.
Spirit, tell me if Tiny Tim will live.
I see a vacant seat in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die.
No, no. Oh no, kind spirit, say he will be spared.
If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population. Man, if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. O God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust.
Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground, but he raised them speedily on hearing his own name.
Mr. Scrooge, I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast.
The founder of the feast, indeed. I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it.
My dear, the children, Christmas Day.
It should be Christmas Day, I am sure, on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow.
My dear, Christmas Day.
I'll drink his health for your sake and the day's, not for his. Long life to him. A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt.
The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow in the party, which was not dispelled for a full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before. From the mere relief of Scrooge, the baleful being done with, Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6 pence weekly. The 2 young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter's being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collars, as if he were deliberating what particular investments he should favor when he came into the receipt of that bewildering income. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a milliner's, then told them what kind of work she had to do, and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest, tomorrow being a holiday she passed at home. Also, she had seen a countess and a lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as Peter, and which Peter pulled up his collar so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. All the time the chestnuts and the jug went round, and by the by, they had a song about a lost child travelling in the snow from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice, and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family, they were not well dressed, their shoes were far from being waterproof, their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, a very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time, and when they faded they looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the spirit's torch at parting. Scrooge had his eyes upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim until the last. By this time it was getting dark and snowing pretty heavily, and by Scrooge and the spirit went along the streets, the brightness of the roaring fires in kitchens, parlors, and all the sorts of rooms were wonderful. And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak and desert moor, where monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about, as though it was the burial place of giants, and water spread itself wheresoever it listed, or would have done so, but for the frost that held it prisoner, and nothing grew but moss and furze and coarse rank grass. Down in the west the setting sun had left a streak of fiery red, which glared upon the desolation for an instant like a sullen eye, and frowning lower, lower, lower yet, was lost in the thick gloom of the darkest night.
What place is this?
A place where miners live, who labor in the bowels of the earth. But they know me. See?
A light shone from the window of a hut, and swiftly they advanced towards it. Passing through the wall of mud and stone, they found a cheerful company assembled round a glowing fire. An old man and woman with their children and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out gaily in their holiday attire. The old man, in a voice that seldom rose above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste, was singing them a Christmas song. It had been a very old song when he was a boy, and from time to time they all joined in the chorus. So surely as they raised their voices, the old man got quite blithe and loud, and so surely as they stopped, his vigor sank again. The spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge hold his robe, and passing on above the moor, sped. Whither? Not to see. To Scrooge's horror. Looking back, he saw the last of the land, a frightful range of rocks behind them, and his ears were deafened by the thundering of water as it rolled and roared and raged among the dreadful caverns it had worn, and fiercely tried to undermine the earth. Built upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks, some league or so from shore, on which the waters chafed and dashed, the wild year though there stood a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base, and storm birds, born of the wind, one might suppose, as seaweed of the water, rose and fell about it like the waves they skimmed. Again the ghost sped up above the black and heaving sea, on, until being far away, as he told Scrooge from any shore, they lighted on a ship. They stood beside the helmsman at the wheel. They looked out in the bow, the officers who had the watch, dark ghostly figures in their several stations, but every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day with homeward hopes belonging to it. And every man on board, waking or sleeping, good or bad, had had a kinder word for another on that day than on any day in the year, and had shared to some extent in its festivities, and had remembered those he cared for at a distance, and had known that they delighted to remember him. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind and thinking what a solemn thing it was to move on through the lonely darkness over an unknown abyss, whose depths were secrets are profound as death. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while thus engaged, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room with the spirit standing, smiling by his side, and looking at that same nephew with approving affability. If you should happen by any unlikely chance to know a man more blessed in laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and I'll cultivate his acquaintance. It is fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things, that while there is infection in disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor. When Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his sides, rolling his head, and twisting his face into the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends, being not a bit blind-handed, roared out lustily, ha, 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 ha.
He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live. He believed it too.
More shame for him, Fred,
said Scrooge's niece indignantly. Bless those women, they never do anything by halves, they are always in earnest. She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was, all kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head. Altogether, she was what you would have called provoking, you know, but satisfactory too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory.
He's a comical old fellow, that's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offenses carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him.
I'm sure he is very rich, Fred. At least you always tell me so.
What of that, my dear? His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking that he's ever going to benefit us with it.
I have no patience with him.
Oh, I have. I'm sorry for him. Couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself always. Here he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner?
Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner,
interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges because they had just had dinner, and with the dessert upon the table were clustered round by the fire lamplight.
Well, I'm very glad to hear it, because I have great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper?
Topper had clearly got his eye upon one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject, whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed.
Do go on, Fred. He never finishes what he begins to say. He is such a ridiculous fellow.
Scrooge's nephew revelled in another laugh, and as it was impossible to keep the infection off, though, the plump sister tried hard to do it with a romantic vinegar. His example was unanimously followed.
I was only going to say that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments, which could do him no harm. I'm sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his moldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean, to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him. If he finds me going there in good temper year after year and saying, "Uncle Scrooge, how are you?" if it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something. And I think I shook him yesterday.
It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of him shaking Scrooge, but being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring what they laughed at, so that they laughed at any rate, he encouraged them in their merriment and passed the bottle joyously. After a while, they played at forfeits, for it was good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas. And there might have been 20 people there, young and old, but they all played, and so did Scrooge, for wholly forgetting the interest he had in what was going on, and that his voice made no sound in their ears. He sometimes came out with his guess quite loud, and very often guessed quite right, too, for the sharpest needle best Whitechapel warranted not to cut in the eye was not sharper than Scrooge, blunt as he took it in his head to be. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in this mood, and looked upon him with such favor that he begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guest departed, but the spirit said it could not be done.
Here is a new game. Only half hour. Spirit only one.
It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what, he only answering to the questions yes or no. And the case was, the brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, a rather disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and walked about the streets, and wasn't made a show of, and wasn't led by anybody, and didn't live in a menagerie, and was never killed in a market, and was not a horse or an ass or a cow or a bull or a tiger or a dog or a pig or a cat or a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, this nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last the plump sister, falling into a similar state, cried out,
I have found it out. I know what it is, Fred. I know what it is.
What is it?
It's your Uncle Scrooge.
which it certainly was.
He has given us plenty of merriment, I am sure, and it will be ungrateful not to drink to his health. Here's a glass of mulled wine ready to our hand at the moment, and I say, Uncle Scrooge.
Well, Uncle Scrooge.
A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, whatever he is. He wouldn't take it from me, but may he have it nevertheless. Uncle Scrooge.
Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have pledged the unconscious company in return and thanked them in an audible speech if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. It was a long night, if it were only a night, but Scrooge had his doubts of this, because the Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into the space of time they passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it, until they left a children's 12th night party when, looking at the spirit, they stood together in an open place. He noticed that its hair was grey.
Are spirits' lives so short?
My life upon this globe is very brief. It ends tonight.
Tonight?
Tonight at midnight. Hark, the time's drawing near.
Forgive me if I am not justified in what I ask, but I see something strange and not belonging to yourself, protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?
It might be a claw, for the flesh there is upon it. Look here.
From the foldings of his robe it brought two children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at its feet and clung out to the outside of its garment.
Oh, man, look here. Look down here.
There were a boy and a girl, yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate too in their humility. Where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tints, a stale and shriveled hand like that of age had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacing. No change, no degradation, no perversion or humanity in any grade, though all the mysteries of wonderful creation has monsters half so horrible and dread. Scrooge stared back, appalled. Having them shown to him in this way, he tried to say they were fine children, but the words choked themselves rather than be parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude.
Spirit, are they yours?
They are man's, and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both and all of their degree, but most of all beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom. Unless the writing be erased, deny it. Slander those who tell it ye. Admit it for your facetious purposes, and make it worse, and abide the end.
Have they no refuge or resource?
Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?
The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw it not. As the lost stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him. Stave 4, the last of the spirits. The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came near him, Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for in the very air through which the spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment, which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. But for this it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night, and separate it from the darkness by which it was surrounded. He felt that it was tall, stately, when it came beside him, and that its mysterious presence filled him with a solemn dread. He knew no more, for the spirit neither spoke nor moved.
I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come.
The spirit answered. The spirit answered not, but pointed onward with its hand.
You are about to show me the shadows of things that have not happened, but will happen in time for us. Is that so, Spirit?
The upper portion of the garment was contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the spirit had inclined its head. That was the only answer he received. Although well used to ghostly company by this time, Scrooge feared the silent shape so much that his legs trembled beneath him, and he found that he could hardly stand when he prepared to follow it. The spirit paused a moment, and observing his condition and giving him time to recover. But Scrooge was all the worse for this. It thrilled him with a vague, uncertain horror, to know that behind the dusky shroud there were ghostly eyes intently fixed upon him, while he, though he stretched his own to the utmost, could see nothing but a spectral hand and one great heap of black.
Ghost of the future, I fear you more than any specter I have seen. But as I know your purpose is to do me good, and I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear your company and do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me?
It gave him no reply. The hand pointed straight before them.
Lead on. Lead on. The night is waning fast, and it is precious time to me, I know. Lead on, Spirit.
The phantom moved away as it had come towards him. Scrooge followed in the shadow of its dress, which bore him up, he thought, and carried him along. They scarcely seemed to enter the city, for the city rather seemed to spring up about them and encompass them of its own act. But there they were, the heart of it, on change amongst the merchants, who hurried up and down and chinked the money in their pockets, and conversed in groups, and looked at their watches, and trifled thoughtfully with their great gold seals, and so forth, as Scrooge had seen them often. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen, observing that the hand was pointed to them. Scrooge advanced on, listened to their talk. "No," said a great fat man with a monstrous chin, "I don't know much about it either way." I only know he's dead.
When did he die?
Inquired another. Last night, I believe.
What was the matter with him?
Asked another, taking a vast quantity of snuff out of a very large snuff box.
I thought he'd never die.
God knows.
What has he done with his money?
I haven't heard. Left it to the company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me, that's all I know. This pleasantry was received with a general laugh.
It's likely to be a very cheap funeral, for upon my life, I don't know anybody to go to it. Suppose we make up a party and volunteer? I don't mind going if a lunch is provided, but I must be fed if I make one.
Another laugh.
Well, I am the most disinterested among you all, after all, for I never wear black gloves and I never eat lunch, but I'll offer to go if anybody else will. When I come to think of it, I'm not at all sure that I wasn't his most particular friend, for we used to stop and speak wherever we met. Bye-bye.
Speakers and listeners strolled away and mixed with other groups. Scrooge knew the men and looked towards the spirit for an explanation. The phantom glided on into a street. Its finger pointed to two persons meeting. Scrooge listened again, thinking that the explanation might lie here. He knew these men also perfectly. They were men of business, very wealthy and of great importance. He had made a point always of standing well in their esteem in a business point of view, that is, strictly in business point of view.
How are you? How are you? Well, old Scratch has got his own at last. Hey, so I'm told, cold, isn't it? Seasonable for Christmas time. You're not a skater, I suppose. No, something else to think of. Good morning.
Not another word. That was their meeting, their conversation, and their parting. Scrooge was at first inclined to be surprised that the spirits should attach importance to conversations apparently so trivial. But feeling assured that they might have some hidden purpose, he set himself to consider what it was likely to be. They could scarcely be supposed to have any bearing on the death of Jacob, his old partner, for that was past, and his ghost province was the future. Nor could he think of anyone immediately connected with himself to whom he could apply them. But nothing doubting that to whomsoever they applied, they had some latent moral for his own improvement. He resolved to treasure up every word he heard, and everything he saw, and especially to observe the shadow of himself when it appeared, for he had an expectation that the conduct of his future self would give him the clue he missed, and would render the solution of these riddles easy. He looked about in the very place of his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to its usual time of day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes that poured in through the porch. It gave him a little surprise, however, for he had been revolving in this mind a change of life, and thought and hoped he saw his newborn resolutions carried out in this. Quiet and dark beside him stood the phantom, with its outstretched hand. When he roused himself from his thoughtful quest, he fancied from the turn of the hand and its situation in reference to himself that the unseen eyes were looking at him keenly. It made him shudder and feel very cold. They left the busy scene and went into an obscure part of town where Scrooge had never penetrated before, although he recognized its situation and its bad repute. The ways were foul and narrow, the shops and houses wretched, the people half-naked, drunken, slipshod, ugly, alleys and archways like so many cesspools disgorged their offences of smell and dirt and life upon the straggling streets, and the whole quarter reeked with crime, with filth, with misery. Scrooge and the phantom came into the pressure of this man just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop. But she had scarcely entered when another woman similarly laden came in too, and she was closely followed by a man in faded black who was no less startled by the sight of them than they had been upon the recognition of each other. After a short period of blank astonishment, in which the old man with the pipe had joined them, they all three burst into a laugh.
Let the charwoman alone to be the first, let the laundress alone to be the second, and let the undertaker's man alone to be the third. Look here, old Joe, here's a chance. We haven't all three met here without meaning it.
You couldn't have met in a better place. Come into the parlor. You were made free of it long ago, you know. And the other two ain't strangers. Stop till I shut the door of the shop. Ah, how it squeaks. There ain't such a rusty bit of metal in the place as its own hinges, I believe. And I'm sure there's no such old bones here as mine. We're all suitable to our calling. We're all well matched. Come into the parlor. Come into the parlor.
The parlor was the space behind the screen of rags. The old man raked the fire together with an old stair rod, and having trimmed his smoky lamp, for it was night, with the stem of his pipe, put it in his mouth again. While he did this, the woman who had already spoken threw her bundle on the floor and sat down in a flaunting manner on a stool, crossing her elbows on her knees and looking with a bold defiance at the other two.
What odds, then? What odds, Mrs. Dilber? Everyone has a right to take care of themselves. He always did.
That's true indeed. No man more so.
Well, why then? Don't stand staring as if you were afraid, woman. Who's the wiser? We're not going to pick holes at each other's coats, I suppose.
No, indeed. We should hope not.
Very well. That's enough. Who's the worse for the loss of a few things like these? Not a dead man, I suppose.
No, indeed.
If he wanted to keep them after he was dead, a wicked old screw. Why wasn't he natural in his lifetime? If he had been, he'd have somebody to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying gasping out his last there alone by himself.
It's the truest word that ever was spoke. It's a judgment on him.
I wish it were a heavier judgment. And it should be. You may depend upon it. If I could have laid my hands on anything else, open that bundle, old Joe, and let me know the value of it. Speak out plain. I'm not afraid to be the first, nor afraid for them to see it. We knew pretty well that we were helping ourselves before we met here. I believe it's no sin. Open the bundle, Joe.
But the gallantry of her friends would not allow of this, and the man in faded black mounting the breech first produced his plundering. It was not expensive. A seal or two, a pencil case, a pair of sleeve buttons, and a brooch of no great value were all. They were severally examined and appraised by old Joe, who chalked the sums he was disposed to give for each upon the wall, and added them up into a total when he found there was nothing more to come.
That's your account, and I wouldn't give another sixpence if I was to be boiled for not doing it. Who's next? I always give too much to ladies. It's a weakness of mine, and that's the way I ruin myself. That's your account. If you asked me for another penny and made it an open question, I'd repent of being so liberal and knock off half a crown.
And now undo my bundle, Joe.
What do you call this? Bed curtains?
Ah, bed curtains.
You don't mean to say you took him down, rings and all, with him lying there?
Yes, I do. Why not?
You were born to make your fortune, and you'll certainly do it.
I certainly shan't hold my hand when I could get anything in it by reaching out for the sake of a man such as he was. I promise you, Joe. Don't drop that oil upon the blankets now.
His blankets?
Who else's do you think? He isn't likely to take cold with them, without him, I dare say.
I hope he didn't die of anything catching, eh?
Don't you be afraid of that. I ain't so fond of his company that I'd loiter about him for such things, if he did. Ah, you may look through that shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find a hole in it, nor a threadbare place. It's the best he had, and a fine one too. They'd have wasted it if it were not been for me.
What do you call wasting of it?
Putting it on him to be buried in it, to be sure. Somebody was a fool enough to do it, but I took it off again. If calico ain't good enough for such a purpose, it isn't good enough for anything else. It's quite becoming of the body. Can't look uglier than he did in that one.
Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror as they sat grouped about their spoil in the scanty light afforded by the old man's lamp. He viewed them with a detestation and disgust which could hardly have been greater, though they had been obscene demons marketing the corpse itself. Laughed the same woman when old Joe, producing a flannel bag with money in it, told out their several gains upon the ground.
This is the end of it, you see. He frightened everyone away from him when he was alive, to profit us when he was dead. Spirit, I see. I see. The case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way now. Merciful heavens, what is this?
He recoiled in terror, for the scene had changed, and now he almost touched a bare, uncurtained bed, on which beneath a ragged sheet there lay something covered up, which, though it was dumb, announced itself in awful language. The room was very dark, too dark to be observed with any accuracy, though Scrooge glanced round it in obedience to a secret impulse, anxious to know what kind of room it was. A pale light, rising in the outer air, fell straight upon the bed, and on it, plundered and bereft, unwatched, unwept, uncared for, was the body of this man. Scrooge glanced towards the phantom. Its steady hand was pointed to the head. The cover was so carelessly adjusted that the slightest raising of it, the motion of a finger upon Scrooge's part, would have disclosed the face. He thought of it, felt how easy it would be to do, and longed to do it, but had no more power to withdraw the veil than dismiss the spectre by his side. O cold, cold, rigid, dreadful death, set up thine altar here, and dress it with such terrors as thou hast any thy command, for this is thy dominion. But of the loved, revered, and honoured head, thou canst not turn one hair to thy dread purposes, or make one feature odious. If is not that the hand is heavy and will fall down when released, it is not that the heart and pulse are still, but that the hand was open, generous, and true, the heart brave, warm, and tender, and the pulse a man's. Strike, shadow, strike, and see his good deed springing from the wound to sow the world with life immortal. No voice pronounced these words in Scrooge's ears, and yet he heard them when he looked upon the bed. He thought, if this man could be raised up now, what would be his foremost thoughts? Avarice, hard-dealing, gripping cares? They have brought him to a rich end, truly. He lay in the dark, empty house, with not a man, a woman, or a child, to say that he was kind to me in this or that, and for the memory of one kind would be kind to him. A cat was tearing at the door, and there was a sound of gnawing rats beneath the hearthstone. What they wanted in the room of death, and why they were so restless and disturbed, Scrooge did not dare to think.
Spirit, this is a fearful place. In leaving it, I shall not leave its lesson. Trust me. Let's go.
Still the ghost pointed with an unmoved finger to the head.
I understand you, and I would do it if I could, but I have not the power, Spirit. I have not the power.
Again it seemed to look upon him.
If there is any person in this town who feels emotion caused by this man's death, show me that person, Spirit, I beseech you.
The phantom spread its dark robe before him for a moment like a wing, and withdrawing it revealed a room by daylight where a mother and her children were. She was expecting someone, and with anxious eagerness she walked up and down the room, started at every sound, looked out from the window, glanced at the clock, tried but in vain to work with her needle, and could hardly bear the voices of children in their play. At length the long-expected knock was heard. She hurried to the door and met her husband, a man whose face was careworn and depressed, though he was young. There was a remarkable expression in it now, a kind of serious delight of which he felt ashamed and which he struggled to repress. He sat down to the dinner they had been hoarding for him by the fire, and when she asked him faintly what news, he appeared embarrassed how to answer.
Is it good or bad?
Bad.
We are quite ruined.
No. There's hope yet, Caroline.
If he relents, there is. Nothing is past hope if such a miracle has happened.
He is past relenting. He is dead.
She was a mild and patient creature, if her face spoke truth, but she was thankful in her soul to hear it, and she said so with clasped hands. She prayed forgiveness for the next moment, and was sorry, but the first was the emotion of her heart.
What the half-drunken woman whom I told you of last night said to me when I tried to see him and obtain a week's delay, and what I thought was a mere excuse to avoid me, turns out to have been quite true. He was not only very ill, but dying then. To whom will our debt be transferred?
I don't know. But before that time, we shall be ready with the money. And even though we are not, it would be bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor in his successor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Caroline.
Yes, softened it as they would, their hearts were lighter. The children's faces hushed and clustered round to hear what they so little understood were brighter, and it was a happier house for this man's death. The only emotion that the ghost could show him caused by the event was one of pleasure.
Let me see some tenderness connected with a death. Or that dark chamber spirit, which we just left now, will be forever present to me.
The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet, and as they went along, Scrooge looked here and there to find Cratchit's, but nowhere else to be seen. They entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated round the fire. Quiet, very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were very quiet.
And he took a child and set him in the midst of them.
Where had Scrooge heard those words? He had not dreamed them. The boy must have read them out, as he and the spirit crossed the threshold. Why did he not go on? The mother laid her work upon the table and put her head upon her face.
The color hurts my eyes. The color. Ah, poor Tiny Tim. They're better now again. It makes them weak by candlelight, and I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home for the world. It must be near his time.
Past it rather, but I think he has walked a little slower than he used these few last evenings, Mother.
I have known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder very fast indeed. But he was very light to carry, and his father loved him so that it was no trouble. There is your father at the door.
She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob and his comforter, he had need of it, poor fellow, came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help him to it most. Then the two young Cratchits got upon their knees and laid each child a little cheek against his face as they said, "Don't mind it, father, don't be grieved." Bob was very cheerful with them, and spoke pleasantly to all the family. He looked at the work upon the table and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said.
Sunday? You went today then, Robert?
Yes, my dear, I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on a Sunday. My little child. My little child.
He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it and his child would have been farther apart than they were. He left the room and went upstairs to the room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. There was a chair set close beside the child, and there were signs of someone having been there lately. Poor Bob sat down in it, and when he had thought a little and composed himself, he kissed the little face. He was reconciled to what had happened and went down again quite happy. They drew about the fire and talked, the girls and the mother working still. Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew, whom he had scarcely seen but once, and who, meeting him in the streets that day, and seeing that he looked a little, just down a little, you know.
On which, for he is the pleasantest spoken gentleman you ever heard, I told him. I am heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit, he said, and heartily sorry for your good wife. By the by, how he ever knew that, I don't know.
You what, my dear?
Why, that you were a good wife.
Everybody knows that.
Very well observed, my boy. I hope they do. Heartily sorry, he said, for your good wife. If I can be of service to you in any way, he said, giving me his card. That's where I live. Pray come to me. Now it wasn't for the sake of anything he might be able to do for us, so much as for his kind way, that this was quite delightful. It really seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim and felt with us.
I'm sure he's a good soul.
You would be sure of it, my dear. If you saw and spoke to him, I shouldn't be at all surprised. Mark what I say, if he got Peter a better situation.
Only to hear that, Peter.
And then Peter will be keeping company with someone and setting up for himself. And get along with you.
It's just as likely as not. One of these days, though, there's plenty of time for that, my dear. But however and whenever we part from one another, I am sure we shall none of us forget poor Tiny Tim, shall we? Or this first parting that there was among us.
Never, Father.
And I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, although he was a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it. I am very happy. I am very happy.
Mrs. Cratchit kissed him, and his daughters kissed him, and the two young Cratchits kissed him, and Peter and himself shook hands. Spirit of Tiny Tim, thy childish essence was from God.
Hector, something informs me that our parting moment is at hand. I know it, but I know not how. Tell me, what man that was whom we saw lying dead?
Ghost of Christmas yet to come conveyed him as before, though at a different time, he thought. Indeed, there seemed no order in these later visions, save that they were in the future. Into the last resorts of business men, but showed him not himself. Indeed, the spirit did not stay for anything, but went straight on to an end just now desired, until besought by Scrooge to tarry for a moment.
This court, through which we hurry now, is where my place of occupation is, and has been for a length of time. I see the house. Let me behold what I shall in days to come.
The spirit stopped. The hand was pointed elsewhere.
The house is yonder. Why do you point away?
The inexorable finger underwent no change. Scrooge hastened to the window of his office and looked in. It was an office still, but not his. The furniture was not the same, and the figure in the chair was not himself. The phantom pointed as before. He joined it once again, and wondering why and whither he had gone, accompanied it until they reached an iron gate. He paused to look round before entering. A churchyard. Here, then, the wretched man whose name he had now to learn lay underneath the ground. It was a worthy place, walled in by houses, overrun by grass and weeds, the growth of a vegetation's death, not life, choked up with too much, burring of fat, with repleted appetite, a worthy place. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. He advanced towards it trembling. The phantom was exactly as it had been, but he dreaded that he had new meaning in its solemn shape.
Before I draw nearer to that stone to which you point, answer me one question. Are these the shadows of things that will be, or are they the shadows of things that may be only?
Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood.
Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends, to which, if preserved in, they must lead. But if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it is thus, what you show me.
The spirit was immovable as ever. Scrooge kept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge.
Am I the man who laid upon the bed?
The finger pointed from the grave to him and back again.
No, spirit. Oh no.
The finger still was there.
Spirit, hear me. I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I have been, but for this intercourse, why show me this if I am past all hope?
For the first time, the hand appeared to shake.
Good spirit, your nature intercedes for me and pities me. Assure me that I yet may change these shadows that you have showed me by an altered life.
The kind hand trembled.
I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, present, and future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, Tell me I may sponge away the writing on the stone.
In his agony, he caught the spectral hand. It sought to free itself, but he was strong in his entreaty and detained it. The spirit stronger yet repulsed him. Holding up his hands in a last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. Stave 5. The end of it. Yes, and the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own. Best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own to make amends in.
I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. Oh, Jacob Marley, heaven and the Christmas time be praised for this. I say it on my knees. Oh, Jacob, on my knees.
He was so fluttered and so glowing with his good intentions that his broken voice would scarcely answer to his call. He had been sobbing violently in this conflict with the spirit, and his face was wet with tears.
They are not torn down. They are not torn down, rings and all. They are here. I am here. The shadows of things that would have been may be dispelled. They will be. I know they will.
His hands were busy with his garments all the time, turning them inside out, putting them on upside down, tearing them, mislaying them, making them parties to every kind of extravagance.
I do not know what to do. I am light as a feather. I am happy as an angel. I am merry as a schoolboy. I am giddy as a drunk man. A Merry Christmas to everybody. A Happy New Year to all the world. Hello, here, whoop, hello. I don't know what day of the month it is. I don't know how long I've been among the spirits. I don't know anything. I'm quite a baby. Never mind, I don't care. I'd rather be a baby. Hello, whoop, hello there.
Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head. No fog, no mist, clear, bright, jovial, stirring cold, cold piping from the blood to dance to, golden sunlight, heavenly sky, sweet fresh air, merry bells, oh glorious, glorious.
What's today?
Cried Scrooge, calling down to a boy in Sunday clothes who perhaps had loitered in to look about him.
Hey?
What's today, my fine fellow?
Today? Why, Christmas Day.
It's Christmas Day. I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. They can do anything they like. Of course they can. Of course they can. Hello, my fine fellow.
Hello?
Do you know the Poulters in the next street, but one all at the corner?
I should hope I did.
An intelligent boy. A remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging in there? Not the little prize turkey, the big one.
What, the one as big as me?
What a delightful boy. It is a pleasure to talk to him. Yes, my buck.
It's hanging there now?
It is. Go and buy it.
Walker?
No. I am in earnest. Go and buy it and tell him to bring it here that I may give them direction of where to take it. Come back with the man and I will give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes and I will give you half a crown.
The boy was off like a shot. He must have a steady hand and a trigger who could have shot off half so fast.
I'll send it to Bob Cratchit. He shan't know who sent it. It should be twice the size of Tiny Tim. Joe Miller never made a joke as sending it to Bob's will be.
The hand in which he wrote the address was not a steady one, but write it he did, somehow, and went downstairs to open the street door ready for the coming of the Poulter's man. As he stood there, waiting his arrival, the knocker caught his eye.
I shall love it, as long as I live. I scarcely ever look at it before. What an honest expression it has in its face. It's a wonderful knocker. Here's the turkey. Hello, Whoop. How are you? Merry Christmas.
It was a turkey. He never could have stood upon his legs and bird. He would have snapped him short for a minute like sticks of sealing wax.
Why, it is impossible to carry that to Camden Town. You must have a cab.
The chuckle with which he said this, and the chuckle with which he paid for the turkey, and the chuckle with which he paid for the cab, and the chuckle with which he recompensed the boy, were only to be exceeded by the chuckle with which he sat down breathless in his chair again and chuckled till he cried. He dressed himself all in his best, and at last got out into the streets. The people were by this time pouring forth as he had seen them with the ghost of Christmas present, and walking with his hands behind him, Scrooge regarded everyone with a delighted smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant, in a word, that 3 or 4 good-humored fellows said, "Good morning, morning, sir. A Merry Christmas to you." And Scrooge said often afterwards that all of the blithe sounds he had ever heard, those were the blithest in his ears. He had not gone far when, coming on towards him, he beheld the portly gentleman who had walked into his counting house the day before and said, "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe?" It sent a pang across his heart to think how this old gentleman would look upon him when they met, but he knew what path lay straight before him, and he took it.
My dear sir,
Said Scrooge, quickening his pace and taking the old gentleman in both his hands.
how do you do? I hope you succeeded yesterday. It was very kind of you. A Merry Christmas to you, sir.
Mr. Scrooge.
Yes, that is my name, and I fear it may not be pleasant to you. Allow me to ask you your pardon, and will you have the goodness?
Here Scrooge whispered in his ear,
Lord bless me. My dear Mrs. Scrooge, are you serious?
If you please, not a farthing less. A great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. Will you do me that favor?
My dear sir, I don't know what to say to such
Don't say anything, please. Come and see me. Will you come and see me?
I will.
Thank you. I am much obliged to you. I thank you 50 times. Bless you.
He went to church and walked about the streets and watched the people hurrying to and fro and patted children on the head and questioned beggars and looked down into kitchens of houses and up to the windows and found that everything could yield him pleasure. He had never dreamed that any walk, that anything could give him so much happiness. In the afternoon, he turned his steps towards his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock, but he made a dash and he did it.
Is your master at home, my dear? Yes, sir. Where is he, my love? He's in the dining room, sir, along with the mistress. I shall show you upstairs, if you please. Thank you. He knows me,
said Scrooge, with his hand already on the dining room lock.
I'll go in here, my dear.
He turned it gently and sidled his face in round the door. They were looking at the table, for these young housekeepers are always nervous on such points and like to see that everything is right.
Fred.
Dear heart alive, how his niece by marriage startled. Scrooge had forgotten for the moment about her sitting in the corner with the footstool, or he wouldn't have done it on any account.
Why, bless my soul, who's that?
It is I, your Uncle Scrooge. I have come to dinner. Will you let me in, Fred?
Let him in? It is a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. He was at home in 5 minutes. Nothing could be heartier. His niece looked just the same. So did Topper when he came. So did the plump sister when she came. So did everyone when they came. Wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful inanity, wonderful happiness. But he was early at the office next morning. Oh, he was early there. If he could only be first and catch Bob Cratchit coming late, that was the thing he had set his heart upon. And he did it. Yes, he did. The clock struck 9. No Bob. 1/4 past. No Bob. He was a full 18 minutes and a half behind his time. Scrooge sat with his door wide open that he might see him come into his tank. His hat was off before he opened the door, his comforter too. He was on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock.
Hello?
Growled Scrooge in his accustomed voice, as near as he could feign it.
What do you mean by coming here at this time of day?
I am very sorry, sir. I am behind my time.
You are. Yes, I think you are. Step this way, sir, if you please.
It's only once a year, sir. It shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir.
Now, I'll tell you what, my friend. I am not going to stand in this sort of thing any longer. And therefore, I am about to raise your salary.
Bob trembled and got a little nearer to the ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it, holding him and calling to the police and court for help in a strait waistcoat.
A Merry Christmas, Bob. A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavor to assist your struggling family. And we will discuss your affairs this afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop. Bob, make the fires and buy another coal scuttle before you. I, Bob Cratchit.
Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good world would. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good at which some people did not have their fill of laughter in the outset. And knowing that such as these things would be blind anyway, he thought it quite as well that they should wrinkle up their eyes in grins as have the malady in less attractive forms. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. He had no further intercourse with spirits, but lived upon the total abstinence principle ever afterwards, and it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that truly be said of us, and all of us, and so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone. Thank you guys so much for watching. Have happy holidays, and we will see you all in 2023.